Stewing produces tender, flavorful dishes of meat, poultry, or seafood cooked in a flavorful sauce. Stews are distinguished from braises in two ways. First, the foods are typically cut into small pieces, and second, the foods are completely covered with the cooking liquid. Veal blanquette gives us an opportunity to examine the basic elements of a good stew, as well as demonstrate an effective way to stew meat in a professional kitchen. Trim the veal and cut into cubes, cutting across the grain for the best texture. Depending on how you handle the meat, you can influence its final flavor and appearance. Season them with salt and pepper. A blanquette is a light-colored stew, so this meat is ready to combine with the stock. For other stews, you may need to briefly sauté or even brown the meat. Classically, you would blanch the veal cubes and strain them to extract the impurities and whiten the meat. Today's veal is a much better product, and this step is not as essential. Place the veal in a pot and pour simmered stock over it. This step shortens the overall cooking time and improves the texture of the dish. Return to a simmer and stir from time to time. Skimming is necessary to remove impurities. Most stews use aromatics like this bouquet garni we're adding to the blanquette. Add supporting or garnishing ingredients at the optimal point so they properly flavor and finish the stew. Stewed foods are completely covered with a cooking liquid throughout the cooking time. Continue to simmer until the veal is tender to the bite, 30 to 45 minutes more. To make finishing the blanquette easier, we're lifting out the veal. For this blanquette, we're thickening the sauce with a prepared roux after the veal is properly stewed. Whisk to initially blend the roux and continue to stir frequently since starches tend to stick to the pan and scorch. Then simmer and skim until the sauce has a great flavor and body with no lingering hint of flour. Return the veal and any juices it has released to the sauce, along with the pre-cooked pearl onions and mushrooms. Earlier, these onions were fully cooked and the mushrooms gently stewed in stock, giving them a rich flavor and color. Simmer until all of the ingredients are hot. To finish the stew, we're adding a liaison of cream and egg yolks for richness, color, and extra flavor. Blend the egg yolks and cream to make a liaison. Add some of the simmering liquid to temper the liaison. This step is important to keep the liaison perfectly smooth. Return the liaison to the pan. Simmer until the stew is lightly thickened to bind the sauce. Once the liaison is returned to the pan, be sure not to bring it to a boil or the eggs could curdle. The eggs in the liaison are fully cooked when the stew reaches 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Properly cooked stewed foods should be easy to cut with the side of a table fork. The natural juices of the ingredients, along with the cooking liquid, become concentrated and provide both good flavor and a full-bodied sauce. Serve the blanquette in heated bowls or plates.
People have been eating stews since time began for a lot of reasons. One is one-pot meals. Secondly, most of the time the protein items that went into stews were work animals and tougher cuts of meat. And so stewing inherently takes time, lots of slow cooking, and it really breaks down the tough cuts of meats and make them more palatable. Braising and stewing are similar in a lot of ways. Both require searing of the meat to lock in the flavor and to get some caramelization on the meat. Both are moist heat cooking methods, or even combination cooking techniques, and that combination being searing and then adding a liquid and braising. Some of the differences are the amount of liquid that is used in the cooking method, as well as the size of the meat that's used. They can be done ahead of time, and they can be either held in the refrigerator at proper temperatures, removed and then brought up to temperature for service, or held at proper temperatures and then be served very quickly. The correct pots for a stew really sort of goes back to what I said earlier. A large cast iron pot is very good, or a heavy pot, a pot that's going to conduct heat very well. The heavier the pot, the better the sear is going to be, the less likelihood of it burning. So a good heavy pot is very important. Ultimately, you want to have a gentle cooking of the stew and not a boiling. Boiling is actually going to toughen the meat before it makes it tender. So. You can stew white meats, and classically those types of stews, or that meat after it was cut into cubes, would oftentimes be blanched. Blanching did a few things similar to searing, and that was to seal the meat, but more importantly, probably to remove some of the impurities. And so that's one big difference between using a red meat and a white meat. And what ties all the stews together is usually being served with vegetables. The quality of the liquid that you use for that specific stew is, it could be a fish stew, it could be a beef stew, a rabbit stew. It's really important, first of all, to have a really good stock to make your stew with. If you have a good stock, if you choose the correct cuts of meat, that really is the biggest hurdle in the beginning to get over. Another important thing to remember is that fresh herbs really make a big difference in making stews. I know my mother used dried herbs, and her stews were good, but then people really didn't use fresh herbs, and so today we have the availability of lots of fresh herbs, so fresh herbs are very important, but it really comes back to having a good stock to make your stew. The amount of stock that goes into a stew is greater than a braise. Finishing a braise it might be by reduction, whereas a stew, you would possibly add a little bit of flour or a roux in the beginning to tighten the sauce up that surrounds the meat. So the sauce is a little bit different in the way it's thickened oftentimes, and the amount of sauce that actually is served with both. Some of the problems that incur when stewing are simple problems to correct. One problem is searing the meat correctly. People oftentimes are impatient, and I mentioned earlier that an important part of stewing is having some patience, and that patience is to make sure that the meat is seared correctly. So that's one big problem, because remember, if you don't sear the meat correctly, ultimately it's not going to be as juicy, the sauce is not going to be as dark, the meat's not going to be as caramelized. So that searing process is very important. The second problem with stewing that sometimes arises with stewing is not cooking the meat enough. You've got to, again, have patience and cook it until it's fork tender. The sanitation concerns for stewing, like any other cooking technique, certainly are very important. It's very important especially we talked about large quantity of cooking, it's very important to understand the sanitation aspects of cooling that stew down in the proper time to the proper temperature. Cooling down process, certainly it's important to understand that it has to be cooled down as fast as possible to a correct temperature and stored at the correct temperature. Stewing for catering or large volume is perfect. We talked about some of the equipment for stewing was a large cast iron pan or heavy pan, but also in a commercial kitchen you could use a tilt skillet, which would be perfect. And so you could easily make 500 portions of stew in a tilt skillet, and it would be the perfect item to serve because it's all in one pot. Stewing always reminds me of a house that I used to live in, actually here in the Hudson Valley. And the house was built in 1750. And when I first went into that house, the thing that struck me was the center fireplace, which obviously used to be the kitchen. And on that fireplace was a cast iron bar, which moved back and forth. And on that cast iron bar was a giant cauldron. And it always reminds me of sort of how we always ate, and the type of foods that we always ate, and those were stewed foods for the most part. So it's really in our history of eating to eat stewed and braised foods. And we would oftentimes start that fire up in that fireplace and make stew, which is, you know, really a simple moist heat cooking method using tough ingredients, or oftentimes with vegetables, and it's sort of how our grandparents and great-grandparents have eaten, and since time began, people have been eating stews.